Well, I genuinely and profoundly appreciate the opportunity. In fact, joining you to talk about the intersection of law and economics and the natural world, I view as an awesome opportunity. I think we share the responsibility for collecting and evaluating information, developing new ideas, and taking them out into the world. And in part, that's the responsibility of the programming of the Pharos Foundation. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. I think that's a gift to us all, and it's emblematic of what the best can be done with a university community. Collecting and evaluating information and taking these ideas into the world. Now today I will argue for two propositions. I leave it to you to determine which is more important, and if the second necessarily will flow from the first. The first proposition is a description about me. But I believe it's also a description about you and about each person here tonight. It is simply, I'm an environmentalist. And by the end of the afternoon, I think you'll see that you are too, because an attachment to and a care for the natural world is universal. And it's from that commonality that we start any policy discussion. After an examination of our current policy approaches, we'll come to my second proposition, and that is there is a superior way to regulate our behaviors to achieve environmental outcomes. So the intellectual journey will be from our status quo, a combination of statutory law and administrative regulatory action, to an entirely different pair of institutions. Now, as I said, the combination of statutory law and regulatory action is where we are today. These are the primary institutions that govern how people interact with the natural world. And what I'd like to show you is rather than a reliance on the mode of environmental regulation that comes from the past century, we ought to turn to a different pairing of institutions. It's a combination that is also based in law, but an older and more adaptive form. Therefore, it's more in tune with the natural world. It's more in tune with technological progress, more in tune with people and the problems that they actually face. And as a result, it's more likely to lead to cleaner air and water, more species and habitat protection, and both a healthy ethic of conservation and opportunities for appropriate preservation. The answer will be found in common law precepts married to free market environmental principles. But before we get to the heart of regulatory frameworks, for a moment I'd like us to dwell on an often abused term. And here I'm going to ask you to help me reflect on awe. And by this I mean an older, more powerful concept of the word. I'm talking about awe in the biblical sense. I mean awe that's like the power and majesty of a great and awesome God. Now, whatever one might make of an omnipotent power, we experience awe when in the presence of two phenomena. Awe is found when we are without words to describe an experience. When we're without words. Closely related is a second feature of awe. We feel it when an experience is so large or comprehensive as to overwhelm. So just for a moment, think about what makes you speechless. I invite you, here in this beautiful place, filled with people who are thoughtful, look inward just for a moment. Allow yourself to imagine something that's vast and difficult to explain, immense and incomprehensible. Now, if you have that in your mind, maybe you thought of a sunset, or the lulling randomness of waves on a beach, or even the reaches of outer space. I'm awed by the complexity and the chaotic order of a beehive, the mysteries of childbirth, and always, always by the sea. As a child in the American Midwest, I would daydream about great sailing ships. And looking across innumerable hillsides, those fields of corn became my waves. For you, perhaps it was a piece of music, the curve of a child's eyelash, or the sharp awareness of time and timelessness when you visit the mountains. The great American biologist, Edward O. Wilson, he coined the term biophilia. It's to describe his hypothesis that our species has ingrained in our genes an instinctive bond with nature and living organisms. By his logic, we have spent some 100,000 generations in nature before forming cities and extended communities. This explains an innate love for natural settings. So I had biophilia as a boy, as I do now, and to some degree, according to Wilson, we all have it. It wasn't until I was an adult that I read Pablo Neruda, but I instantly understood the line from his Ode to a Sea. He writes, "I need the sea because it teaches me. And then, in some magnetic way, I move in the university of the waves." Or perhaps you prefer poetry from closer to home. W.H. Auden, he of Christ Church College here at Oxford. He first arrived on scholarship to study biology, I'll note, before changing to English. It was Auden who concluded, "Thousands have lived without love, but not one without water." And so while we share this capacity for awe, it comes to each of us in its own way. And what I'm doing is simply acknowledging that there are things too big, too powerful to fully understand. And when we experience that awe, it leads to what social psychologists call a shrinking of the self. We actually feel smaller when we think about something vast, difficult to describe. Intellectually, that shrinking of the self has an analog. It's called humility. Now, I believe humility is essential to develop the institutions necessary to protect the environment. We must develop a new model for thinking about how to manage our relationship with the natural world. And that is, in fact, the subject of my talk this evening. So together, I'd like to radically reimagine how to structure and continually discover the boundaries of that relationship. We must do so because the current model of environmental policymaking, the current model is on a trajectory to catastrophe. And to accomplish this great task, we need to apply the lessons of both awe and humility. At this point, you would be forgiven for wondering what is all this talk about wonder. Are we here for natural philosophy or for the policy implications of law and economics? And I submit to you, the answer is both. To understand contemporary environmental regulation, I think it's useful to begin with observations about regulation generally. To regulate means to make regular or orderly. Or it can have an explicitly coercive or constraining definition. In the first case, we have a situation like making a queue for tickets at the theater. This regulation makes things orderly, and it can be done more or less formally. The order is often emergent, but even when it's not, like at the theater, it relies on unwritten social norms. And norms are simply how we expect to behave and how we expect others to behave. In America, we have to be told to get in line. Otherwise, you'll just have crowds of people milling about. Here in Britain, social norms do the work, and it's all much less formal. People here will get in a queue for any old reason, sometimes for no reason at all. Now, another form of regulation that is simply to create regularity or order It's clearly illustrated to any adult who visits our two countries. Britons drive on the left, Americans on the right. Neither is necessarily better, but we have a formal rule, and it's socially beneficial. But I want you to remember that to regulate also means to coerce or limit. We regulate private decisions through institutions of law. To regulate in this context, this latter definition, is to supervise, to control, or to restrict private activity. Across liberal developed countries, the relationship between the natural world and society, it's regulated by statutory law, regulatory edicts, and government agencies that set standards for behavior, investigate potential violations of those standards, and then sanction transgressions. All of this is highly reliant on coercive, top-down, expert agency rulemaking. Now, what it lacks is flexibility to adapt to new technologies, flexibility to adapt to variable social preferences. It lacks tools for dispute resolution. This form of regulatory approach presumes knowledge that could not possibly be assembled in one place. And with a focus on rules and compliance, it misses out on the effect on the natural world, as well as the people who inhabit that world. In a word, the reliance on statutory law and administrative regulation lacks humility. It presumes to know how to make myriad trade-offs between our inconsistent preferences, between habitat protection and development, or economic development and pollution, or many other questions. To have such a capacity, to harness such knowledge would be truly awesome, vast, and to my mind, impossible to explain. And if it's impossible to explain, it is therefore impossible to act upon. Here in the United Kingdom, that activity happens at the Environment Agency. In the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, was established some 55 years ago. Today, this one agency is responsible for more than half of all the regulatory costs imposed by our national government. So I recently looked at the National Public Policy and Social Insight Survey. This is produced regularly by the Office of National Statistics in London. And in particular, I looked at the November 2024 survey of British attitudes on environmental policy and climate change. All of this can be found online. I encourage you to have a look. I found it very instructive. But I'd like to share just two observations about it. One question asks, to what extent have you made changes, if any, to your lifestyle to help tackle climate change? 9% of Britons say, I've made a lot of changes. Now, in combination with the 68% of your countrymen who self-report that they have made some change in their life to help with climate change, that means fully 3 of every 4 people have done some or a lot of change. Now, that is instructive. It's action. Now, what's not answered by a social survey or a poll is whether those changes were made voluntarily, and if so, those changes are more likely to be lasting and meaningful. Or were they made because those people had to make the changes because of a council rule on recycling, or a national standard was set for what sort of fuel could be used in automobiles? Those rules tend to be fixed, less adaptive to the different tastes, people with different lifestyles, and certainly to emerging technologies. This leads into the second question that I found very instructive. The responses were very similar to American attitudes, at least directionally. The second question asked survey respondents to rank how important different topics were in their life. Remember, this is a survey on environmental attitudes. The suggested answers were all matters of public concern. These are areas where the government gets involved. And among the dozen categories suggested to the respondents, far and away the most important topic was the cost of living. After the cost of living, the topic capturing the most headspace was the NHS. In America, social scientists doing similar surveys simply label it healthcare. Now, behind these terms, the concerns probably differ. Here, it may be the future of the NHS, availability of service, or one's own health. In America, it's typically the cost and complexity of the healthcare system that worries the public. But nonetheless, similar topics dominate the top. This is what people worry about. The economy generally and crime, they're all at the top of the list. Climate change and the environment, always in the lower half. What's apparent to me from the National Social Insight Survey is that your countrymen are doing things to advance environmental values. This happens even though they don't judge these problems to be the most important, not even in the top half. But across the nation, individuals are able to apply their knowledge toward environmental protection, where they live, where they work, where they play, and where they gather. And here I'm highlighting something we call the knowledge problem. And it's vitally important if you want to use government regulation to tell people how they may or may not use energy, where they may live, how they can use national recreation resources, or any feature of environmental regulation. You need the information. You need that knowledge. Environmental issues are not special in this way. The knowledge problem is endemic to all situations that rely on this close administrative regulation. And it becomes a barrier to effective regulation of any important area that you might think of, from A to Z, or Z, from airline safety to zoning codes. The problem has two parts. Can we gather enough information to plan effectively? This asks if it is possible to gather all the inputs to a situation, analyze their interactions and the constraints, and then reasonably predict the outcomes. And secondly, with a planned or regulated situation, here relying on both the first and second definitions of to regulate, is it possible to learn, or have we limited ourselves to the information that is available today? Students of economics will immediately recognize the parallel to prices. They not only convey information, but create new data about the preferences of consumers and producers in a dynamic environment. And it's the creation of new information that is crucial to address today's biggest environmental problems. So if you care about food insecurity and agriculture, then consider that today there are nearly 750 million people in extreme poverty. Both in absolute terms and as a proportion of the world's population, that number is shrinking. But there are still more than 700 million people without enough nutrition. There are people literally dying for these innovations. And the same story can be told about emissions, mineral and energy extraction, or any number of ways that we interact with the environment. The solutions to radically improve those interactions can only come from new information, new ideas, and new applications of what we know. Breakthroughs won't come from government agencies. To illustrate this point about how we regulate and use mechanisms of law, our individual actions, such as those highlighted by the Social Insight Survey, and our changing preferences, I draw on an anecdote from the work of Mark Twain. It was 1883, and he described an effort to reroute the Mississippi River. One who knows the Mississippi will promptly aver, not aloud, but to himself, that 10,000 river commissions, with the minds of the world at their back, cannot tame that lawless stream, cannot curb it or confine it, cannot say to it, go here or go there, make it obey, cannot save a shore which it has sentenced, and cannot bar a path with an obstruction which it will not tear down, dance over, and laugh at. Like Twain's 10,000 River Commissions, centrally planned rules for how we interact with nature are subject to something more powerful than a written law. It's nature itself, and that includes human nature. Putting all of this together, what I see is that there is evidence of people making changes because they are able to make changes, because they have the necessary information to make those changes in their own behavior, as well as outside of the household, as I said, in their workplace or in their community. Remember, there are more than 3 or 4 Britons doing something or doing a lot to address environmental concerns, and yet it's not near the top of the list of what they care about. Crucially, we can do things where we have local knowledge of what will work. And that means in our home, in our own community, on our land, or in our businesses. Where we have that knowledge, we make the changes, in part because we're able to do so, and because we are flexible and adaptive. So if you want social science to inform our legal and regulatory institutions, like I do, I suggest that we watch what people do and not what they say. But of course, that is determined, at least in part, by what the law says. And as I said earlier, our behaviors are governed by statutory law and administrative regulation. Statutory law is familiar to any student of government. It's the law codified by a legislature. It's accessible to all. It's binding on all. And therefore, anyone can bring a suit before a proper court. In America, some statutes even provide funding to organizations to monitor and subsequently sue polluters who fail to meet regulatory obligations. At our national level, statutes are created by Congress and signed by the President. The original and primary functions of statutory law are to limit the executive or to create rules of general applicability. That's simply saying rules of the road for how we all get along. They're not typically based on property rights, nor does statutory law typically provide compensation to parties who have been damaged by a wrongdoer. The spirit of the law becomes animated by the heavy hand of regulation, standard setting, and the subsequent focus on compliance to those standards. That's the habitat of the environmental regulator. Thus, we have standards for how much water can flow through our toilets and shower heads, limits on how much energy is consumed by household appliances, the fuel efficiencies of cars and trucks, and prescriptions for the sources of energy to create electricity. Each of these mandates is a natural extension of Twain's 10,000 River Commissions. And if someone is harmed by the effects of this prescriptive regulatory control, from a mere inconvenience all the way to a prohibition on how one makes a living, the only recourse is to change the law. There's no way to make that person whole. There's no equity available. Now, I argue that statutory law and its companion reader of federal regulations produced by agencies like the EPA is fundamentally divorced from nature. It keeps us focused on an ever-expanding rule book, prescribing how to act. And the alternative must focus on human behavior and place it within the natural world, not as something outside of nature that must be constantly steered. We ought to have the humility to recognize that different people across the nation will have differing information about how to address their local environmental challenges. They will also have differing preferences about how important those challenges are in light of other pressing concerns. Applied to environmental challenges, common law precepts like nuisance, trespass, and riparian law, which are the legal customs for waterways and their shores, these things can be married to free market principles like property rights and prices. When we do so, joining common law to free market principles, we place ourselves within the context where we can continue to learn and solve disputes as they arise, without the need to foresee every outcome or every consequence of regulation. Environmental solutions do not come from regulation. They are produced by the disciplined application of human ingenuity. That means markets and technology. So my solution is a combination that is also based in law, but in older form. It's more in tune with the natural world, with progress, and therefore more in harmony with people and the problems that we actually face. As a result, it's ultimately more likely to lead to cleaner air and water, more species and habitat rehabilitation and protection, and both a healthy ethic of conservation and opportunities for appropriate preservation. No doubt here, you know that common law is often called English or British common law. Subsequent to William the Conqueror, for nearly 1,000 years, what you gave the world has adapted and evolved based on custom, on precedent, and on judicial decisions. Until the 1970s, just about the time of my own birth, environmental regulation was the product of common law precepts. This is trespass and nuisance. Trespass and nuisance delineate rights for individuals when others' actions create negative outcomes. And as I said a moment ago, riparian rights relate to waterways and their shores. So for example, consider a farmer who owns land that includes a stream used to water his animals and irrigate his crops. An upstream factory pollutes, adversely affecting both the crops and the animals. The farmer has a common law claim based on nuisance, which is more and less understood as interference with another's right to use and enjoy their own property. Nuisance in English common law dates at least to the 13th century and the time of William III. Importantly, in the late 19th century, nuisance standards started to evolve. This happened in direct response to the Industrial Revolution. You see new technologies and new social arrangements brought to the fore new developments in the law. An early case from this era, it's called Bamford v. Turnley. It was ultimately resolved by the England and Wales High Court in 1862. And going back centuries, Britons have had rights to light and air through easements, which are not quite property rights, but privileged grants from the crown. Bamford brought an action against his neighbor, Turnley, alleging that brick kilns on Turnley's property caused injury in the form of fetid air in an unhealthy environment. In this case, Turnley's kilns were placed as far as possible from Bamford's land, and they were being used to make earthen bricks in order to construct his own home. Nonetheless, the fumes carried over to Bamford's home. At trial, Bamford demonstrated that the emissions were a nuisance. They deprived him of reasonable use or enjoyment of his property, such as his air. However, the trial judge instructed the jury to rule in favor of Turnley if the location of the kilns was proper and convenient and a reasonable use of his land. As a result, the jury found for Turnley because the use, building a home, that was reasonable. And yet, the ruling was reversed on appeal. Very importantly, the jury in such a case must focus on the alleged harm to the plaintiff, not on the reasonableness of the person doing the alleged interfering. Weighting the analysis toward the party suffering the alleged harm, that's our common law norm. This is simply a practical extension of the maxim that my freedom to extend my fist ends at the tip of your nose. The law will protect you to do as you please, just so long as you don't hurt anyone, or in this case, stink up his dining room. In a dispute between two neighbors, each of whom has a claim about reasonable use of their property, the common law precepts of nuisance, they've become calibrated to address the actual harms. And the result was Turnley was ordered to pay compensation to Bamford. Unlike a situation with prescriptive regulation, a form of equity was achieved by this payment. Another example, but from America, comes from a 1918 case called Meeks v. Wood. Again, two farmers have adjoining properties. Cheney Meeks is unhappy with his neighbor Martin Wood, who's installed what's called a barker. A barker is a whistle, and it's attached to the exhaust pipe of an engine used to pump oil from a well. The court ruled for Martin Wood, and on its surface it looks like a clear inconsistency, because the outcome went for the person purportedly causing the harm to his nearby neighbor. The case turned on how the court identified the ordinary comforts of living and, importantly, the evidence presented. Now, the court found no interference with the ordinary comforts of living, and thus the barker was not a nuisance, and no liability attached. You see, with solving these discrete disputes, with each successive case, with each presentation of evidence, would-be polluters also learn. Would-be polluters also understand and come to understand what activities will bring them liability. And therefore, the effect is prophylactic. We get less pollution and more innovation in order to avoid this sort of common law tort. And here I think it's important to bring in the complement to common law approaches. I mentioned free market environmentalism. Well, it has two important features. The first thing to know, I've mentioned, it's the emphasis on fundamentals of a market economy, such as property rights, prices, and exchange. But secondly, it's a substitute for traditional regulation. They may have the same goals, but different institutions. They have different decision makers and very different rules of the road. For example, in both our countries, we have national parks where we set aside wild places and preclude various types of development. Similar to your national trust, we have a valuable tradition of private conservation in America. When it comes to forest management, objectives such as the health and vitality of the ecosystem are balanced against the protection of private property and life, prevention of fire, and other uses, certainly including recreation. So in the area where I live, in Northern Virginia, we have regional parks managed by cities and counties. We have access to state and national parks, and a robust system of private conservation. In fact, the most successful raptor preservation project in America, it's called Hawk Mountain, is entirely private. These different modes of regulation, different policies adopted by different institutions, different levels of government, it provides us something of a natural experiment. And crucially, even marginal differences in the effectiveness of these different approaches to regulation really matter, especially at scale. I think fire prevention is a dramatic way to think about it. Each year, Americans lose an average of 7 million acres to more than 60,000 different wildfires. Already in 2025, nearly 1 million acres have burned. That's nearly 1,500 square miles, or about 3% of the landmass of England. If you care about life and property, about wildlife habitat, if you care about massive amounts of particulate and carbon dioxide emissions, then you must care about wildfires. And when we think about those wildfires and their effects, it's critical to address the basic assumption made by most people. That assumption may be widely held here tonight. Most people assume that various government institutions must control the environment, or at least how we interact with it. The alternative, they assume, is that without this government control, without the administrative regulation, people would simply destroy the environment. While this is incorrect, one can see how the idea takes hold. Let's walk through a few examples. And here I'll cover collective action problems, local pollution, and regional or global issues such as air pollution and climate change. Collective action problems describe bad outcomes because of the cumulative effects from individual incentives. Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom tackled this sort of environmental problem with her work on fisheries. If a fishery is susceptible to overfishing and depletion, the incentive for any individual fisherman is to take as big a catch as he can, even to the point of investing in bigger boats or better storage in order to capture more of the resource before it is collected by the rest of the fleet. Time and again, we've seen top-down regulation based on rigid rules or statutes fail in these situations. However, Ostrom developed a theory. She called it polycentric governance. It both relies upon and it creates cooperation and trust because it's rooted in human nature and it prizes transparency. Her research highlights very successful environmental outcomes, things that most people say they prize, such as species protection against endangerment or extinction. It also produces good outcomes for the people involved. Like non-litigious dispute resolution, and the promise that a way of life, a cherished profession like agriculture or fishing, can remain sustainable. Her model looks like the following, and I encourage it as a powerful framework for people everywhere. First and foremost, there are local communities that are involved. Those closest to the environmental resources are put in charge. They have access to the best information. They can see change happening, both for good and for ill, and they have the strongest incentive to fix the problem. The result is better stewardship. Next, there are clearly defined boundaries, and that means explicitly naming or licensing who has access to the resource and listing what activities are allowed or disallowed. Third, polycentrism creates alignment between those who bear the costs of the regulatory regime with those who have access to the benefits. Fourth, there must be strong monitoring. You can't put this in place and walk away. Without monitoring, how would you see the evidence of what is actually working or where there might be a breakdown? It's the monitoring that creates the trust and prevents cheating. And then finally, polycentric governance demands clearly recognized rights. These include both property rights and participation rights. The latter describes who's involved in the decision process that leads to how the resource is managed or regulated. Now, these are all principles with a slightly changed lexicon of free market environmentalism. Clear boundaries and alignment of costs and benefits are economic ideas put into action. Now, with collective action problems, there's nothing necessarily vicious or immoral about the environmental challenges that we face. But what about that greedy factory owner that I mentioned earlier? The one who has no concern for pollution. After all, we know that it's costly to capture or divert waste. What if evil producers polluted our rivers and lakes simply to save a bit of money? Here again, the common law approach to pollution is very effective. The definition of nuisance is an unreasonable interference with another person's use and enjoyment of property. Where there's nuisance, parties receive damages. They become made whole, but only for the actual damages. If the nuisance continues or proves irreparable, there may also be equitable relief, once again making the harmed party whole. And this brings me to air pollution. Climate change presents an entirely different problem for government regulators. One might expect this answer to this sort of regional or even global pollution problem would simply be more clearly defined property rights. That's the answer from Ronald Coase and the subsequent economists who built on his Nobel Prize-winning work. And it is part of the solution. However, in some cases, it's very difficult to assign property rights, which are necessary. They are the necessary condition for the doctrines of nuisance and trespass. However, I think that this might be the case of us focusing on the wrong layer of analysis. So far, I've described free market environmentalism by talking about the essential elements of a market, property rights and the like. For the hard cases like climate change, the answer is right there in the name. This is the free market part of free market environmentalism, because the solutions will not come from this or that regulatory regime. To be very pointed about the matter, promises to the United Nations neither solve climate change, nor do they do anything to improve the quality of our atmosphere. As I've said, solutions will emerge from a disciplined application of human ingenuity. That's another phrase for markets and technology. There's no regulation in the world that transformed the horse and carriage to the automobile. Similarly, it was not regulation that led to the absolute reduction of carbon emissions in the United States. From 1990 to 2022, the total CO2 emissions in America went down by 3%. This happened while both the economy and the population grew. Carbon dioxide emissions fell while the GDP grew fourfold. What's more astonishing is that in 2007, or about halfway through that time period, emissions were more than 15% higher than the baseline. That's to say, for 17 years, emissions went up, and then for the next 15 years, fell near twice as fast. What happened? Well, the economics of coal were overwhelmed by the flood of newly available, lower emission natural gas. This only happened because of technological innovation. With private risk capital, horizontal drilling techniques and new fracturing technology upended all the trend lines for emissions. Energy got cheaper and the economy boomed. The answer to our most challenging environmental problems will be in the market. The folks who risked their lives and fortunes on new drilling, they got fabulously wealthy. But along the way, and this is the key idea, along the way they made hundreds of millions of people much better off, while we also put less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now that I've given you all these examples about pollution, it's time for what might be the most controversial assertion. I'm going to tell you that the optimal level of pollution is not zero. I'd like to say that again. The optimal level of pollution is not zero. And I know on its face this might be shocking. What sort of monster would come here and optimize toward pollution? And the essence of the insight is in trade-offs. It's much more difficult and much more costly to get rid of that last 10% of pollution than it is to eliminate the first 10%, or in some cases, the first 90%. Those resources can be spent more productively. I have one more little story that I'd like to share, and as I do, I want to remind you that people are situated with vastly different circumstances, and therefore will make very different trade-offs. Beginning in 1989, certain communities in Zimbabwe were designated campfire communities. Campfire is a program by the government that established property rights, ownership rights for wildlife. Those rights were settled in the local communities. Rather than hunting for their own uses or ignoring the wildlife as they had done for generations, Zimbabweans recognized that a much higher value to their community is available. That was found by partnering with a hunting outfitter, often from the United States, and using contracts. So the wealthy outsiders came in and they paid for trophy hunts. Market tools, contract and property governed. And the results? we saw a 15 to 25% increase in the income of those communities. There's a clear incentive to protect the resource. Now, how do we know that the incentive is there? It's not something you can touch. Well, we know because of how the people behaved and the results of that behavior. For example, in the first 3 decades of the program, the elephant population around the campfire communities doubled. And of course, well-meaning regulation is also part of the story. Unfortunately, it's the part that we put under the label, beware of unintended consequences. You see, in 2014, the United States implemented a statutory ban enforced by regulatory inspection. The ban was on the import of elephant trophies, and the result was a 5-fold increase in poaching. The per capita income in Zimbabwe is less than $3,800 a year. Here in Britain, it's more than 15 times higher. And in the United States, at more than $83,000 a year, it's nearly 22 times as high as in Zimbabwe. Clearly, the people in these different countries will have very different social and economic pressures. We might even value different things. You and I might not like trophy hunting, even to the point with our fellow citizens of passing a law to ban it. But, like the people in the local campfire communities, we all value a healthy and growing elephant herd. And therefore, the institutions we select to regulate behavior have real, demonstrable effects when they balance those trade-offs. It's a miracle of market capitalism that through contract, property rights, and exchange, people from each of those countries can become better off. That is simply to say they get more of what they value, and they do so while simultaneously dramatically improving environmental outcomes. Campfire has been labeled a community-based natural resource management tool. What is that? It's simply Ostrom's polycentrism by another name. Instead of fisheries and fishing communities, the Zimbabwean communities in close contact with wildlife ecosystems, they're given the authority, the incentives, and the very rich rewards available from wildlife recovery. Free market principles applied to environmental objectives means both the humans and the wildlife populations can flourish. So this evening I began with 2 propositions. The first is that we share a love and responsibility for the natural world. I said we're all natural environmentalists. The second is a normative claim, that we ought to shift from reliance on one pairing of institutions, statutory law and administrative regulation, to a second pairing. Going forward, we should emphasize common law and free market environmentalism. I believe that common law precepts, when paired to principles like property, is the way forward. It's rooted in our human nature. And importantly, it leaves the door open to discover solutions to our most important problems of the day. This doesn't have to be an either-or proposition. I think of our alternatives on a continuum, moving in the right direction, collecting more evidence along the way about what works, about how people actually respond. That is more important than designing a perfect law or regulation. As with science, we need to test our theories and our legal institutions against actual outcomes. Knowledge will accumulate through time, like the wisdom of our common law norms. We find that innovative ideas can come from any group of people, and there should not be a single source like the Environment Agency. I posit that it will oftentimes come from people who pursue their love of nature. About 6 years after producing a seminal piece of nature writing, his love of nature, Henry David Thoreau wrote in a journal that every poet has trembled on the verge of science. I think that's a fascinating line. putting poetry and science together. At the time, after having spent time at Walden, Thoreau was in the process of devouring books on ornithology, very scientific books. You see, once he had been to and lived in the woods of Walden Pond, he was compelled to deepen his knowledge and understanding of the birds he had immortalized as an essayist. Thoreau saw the world with the eyes of a poet and a philosopher. He was a naturalist. In the same journal, he concluded, "The poet's relation to his theme is the relation of a lover." That's biophilia. It is an example. It's an instruction for us all to think critically about the environment and about markets and the law and how we can get the institutions right. Thank you all for joining me tonight.
Thank you very much, Kent. I think we've got 15, 20 minutes or so. We can have some questions. We can also have some discussion.
Very good.
Who'd like to kick us off? We need that as well.
Sure.
Thanks for a very interesting and, in fact, moving talk. I was wondering if you think there's a distinction to be drawn between, on the one hand, climate change and global problems with the atmosphere, and on the other, local pollution. I mean, both in terms of the public perception of what the problems are, and in terms of what are the appropriate remedies for it.
Yes. Short answer, yes. Let's start with the first half. The perceptions. I think any inspection, and we've seen this from academic work, we've seen this in social science survey work, we see this with journalists. People understand local pollution issues much better. They believe they have more facts. Those facts that they believe they know tend to be more true, or more of them are true, excuse me. They have fewer errors of judgment about it. With global questions, with atmospheric questions, which are a category of global, right? With climate change, much of what people think they believe is in error. The scientific work is not necessarily wrong. It just has not been translated to common understanding. So that's the first distinction. But what I tried to illustrate is that these two types of pollution type problems, emissions, local emissions, global emissions, they can be handled with different aspects of free market environmentalism. On the one hand, it really leans into the common law. Local pollutions are going to have local solutions where you are going to know if it's a nuisance or if it's a trespass. The solutions to things like emissions into the atmosphere and the effects that it has on climate, that will not come from a regulatory rule book. That's going to come from market-driven changes. Electing to stop using energy is not a prescription that has been adopted ever. Energy use has only ever gone up in the history of civilization. Maybe it would work this time if we say we're all going to shrink our economic output. But that's betting against a long history of activity. So I think there the answer is not leaning into the common law. It's leaning into the evolution and adoption of new technologies. It's a really important distinction about the category of problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on regulation of nuclear power? It's often seen to be very clean and a much better alternative to traditional fossil fuels, but obviously there is great danger in having lots of nuclear plants in certain areas, in certain countries that might misuse them.
Yeah. I will lead with what maybe is the conclusion, and for that I apologize. I'm a tremendous advocate for nuclear power. There are no safe alternatives. There is only placing risk against risk. And we are going to have human activity that will be powered by energy, and then we therefore need to determine what type of risks are we going to take on. The principal risks associated with nuclear power are in storage of spent fuel, whether they're the grains, the pebbles, or the fuel rods. New nuclear plants, plants that are coming online and just being contracted to be built now, the waste production is much, much smaller than the fleet of nuclear plants that are in place across America, across France, across mostly the West right now. So that's a good thing, because then you don't have to trade off as much of the risk of storage, transfer and storage of the waste. Oftentimes you can store it in place. New nuclear modules are being designed much like the nuclear fleet, the nuclear navy. The United States has put into the sea more than 200 ships in the last 75 years that are nuclear powered. And I want to be very careful to note right at the front, the nuclear plant in an aircraft carrier, modern aircraft carrier will have 4 or 5, is not the same as the sort that would be for a city. They have different design specifications. With that caveat, I just don't want you to think I'm comparing apples and apples. The nuclear fleet, it's designed that once you turn them on, they run until they run out. So for the lifespan of that ship. And we can do the same. So the containment of the waste, it never comes back out of the nuclear plant. Dramatically cutting the risks, again, risk versus risk. The risks associated with transporting and storing what the result of your fuel production. I am thankfully removed from, I think most of us are removed from, but we should not stop thinking about the risks associated with other fuel sources. So pulling oil or coal or other fuels out of the ground is very dangerous. Using physics and nuclear power has its own risks, but the 2 failures that we know of, one had to do with both maintenance, design and maintenance of the facility, Chernobyl, and the other had to do with where it was placed. I would caution against, I studied philosophy, not physics, but I would caution against nuclear facilities on fault lines or near them, Fukushima. And the leakage, right, was contained in both situations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, though, that the primary risk associated with nuclear power is Chernobyl-style or Fukushima-style disasters. I mean, they don't kill very many people when they happen, and they happen extremely rarely. The risk is that it proliferates all over the world and leads to somebody crazy getting the bomb. And the worry expressed by some people, including libertarians like Peter Thiel, is that as nuclear power becomes more widely available, the risks of the wrong people getting the bomb obviously increase proportionately. And then you get kind of this paradoxical effect where you need some kind of international governance structure to decide which nations are allowed to have nuclear power and the bomb by extension, and which nations are not allowed to have nuclear power. And that's how you get sort of a world government, which we don't presumably want.
Yeah. So I think there's two parts to that. The first is to recognize nuclear power, nuclear fuel is not the same as nuclear enriched weaponry, right? And the chain of technologies, I grant there is a chain of technologies that when you master one, it necessarily leads to the other. So addressing that, those textbooks exist. They're online available for download. and putting a nuclear plant in Cairo is not the problem, right? The second issue raised, someone skeptical of a global regulatory regime to manage nuclear stockpile. I would simply posit we can solve problems now for those 700 million people that are below basic nutritional standards, or we can solve problems that may or may not emerge in the future. And I'm going to focus the balance of my interests with less of a distant timeline. I don't think it's an insignificant problem. I just don't think it's the problem we have to worry about most right now. Everyone is so polite. I'm used to tomatoes and things.
Thank you very much. There are interesting synergies between what you said and actually what we were talking about earlier, which was the great power scene. And I wondered whether, because you talked about there being more pressing concerns than climate change in terms of, poverty and whatever. Do you think that also the increase in great power tensions over the last 5, maybe 10 years has changed the perspective on that as well? It's just one has the impression as if climate change has receded a bit in the past couple of years as a kind of global concern because of Ukraine, Gaza, that kind of thing. Has that also been your observation? Is my question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that we all need to grapple with. Not just this evening, but through time. We need to keep examining this question. My sense is that there was a sharpening of awareness. Our eyes were open, but then the light turned on when war emerged in Europe in the last 3.5 years, or since 2014. Wherever you set your calendar. War in Europe changing the energy profile of Europe means that suddenly the greatest advocates for shutting down nuclear plants in Germany were cutting down trees to burn wood pellets, right? Because northern latitudes, it gets dark and it gets cold for many months in a row, right? My sense is that leading into that eye-opening experience for all of us, not just for Europeans, there was something of a false calm where the UN apparatus, the other multilateral organizations and legal arrangements were able to say one thing and look away at the energy profile in India and China and Russia. So up until about a year ago, China was putting in and turning on 50 coal plants a year. No one can turn off enough coal. There aren't enough coal plants in the world that we could shutter to balance out the emission profile, right? And so all of the various institutions, including the UN COP, to say, oh, well, we're going the right direction. We're going to suddenly fix this by agreeing to fix it. But we're going to exclude China. We'll give a permission slip to Russia to do as they please. And we'll look the other way at India. It just didn't make sense. And I think that probably hit a high watermark about 2 or 3 years ago, coincident but not because of war emerging in Europe. So it all came together, but not causal.
Little bit of a shift in tack. And you can challenge the premise if you like. Why do you think the left has been vastly more successful in claiming environmentalism as an issue than the right? I think there's
artifacts of history, and then there's artifacts of kind of human nature, and they combine. They overlap. The artifacts of history maybe speak to the question about nuclear, right? The modern contemporary environmental movement is about as old as I am. In the mid-1960s, concerns about nuclear proliferation and warfare and pesticides kind of came together for people to advocate absent scientific information. The anti-war and nuclear disarmament efforts kind of glommed on to other environmental concerns. They weren't necessarily the same thing, but they fused. Subsequent to that, it took a couple decades, but by the turn of the century, there was, and I use this term broadly, not in the very strict, narrow sense, there was profit to be made by being an environmentalist. So suddenly, organizations, NGOs, they became of scale where they could be, it was no longer save the whales off of, hunting down the Japanese fleet for whaling. It was, we're going to transform agriculture in the world, right? They could be a global presence. They could raise money globally. They became so large that it kind of escaped the actual practical environmental problems. And that lends itself to, people like to feel good about themselves. They want to contribute to something that is a good, a value that they share. Well, I share the value of improved agriculture around the world. And if I don't think too hard about what that means for water consumption or for GMOs or for pesticides, then I'll just attach myself to changing agriculture, helping people in the southern hemisphere. So there's two different stages there, I think. But really it just speaks to something that I think everyone on the left would like to agree with me about, which is most people are good, and they want to do good things. And if you don't focus a lot of time and energy and thought behind it, assigning yourself to a movement that says we're doing good things, you just naturally gravitate there. No one recognizes that the godmother of pesticide regulation in America, Rachel Carson, most of her book was inaccurate.
Silent Spring. Yeah.
Silent Spring. The actual evidence presented in the book was wrong. At our EPA, the grand hall where the administrator comes out to make announcements and to sign regulations, it's called the Rachel Carson Hall. She was greatly concerned with birds, but also as the thinning of the shell, et cetera, but also as it would relate to human health. I don't think she's a bad woman. I think she had poor science, and she created the conditions where people didn't have to think hard about the science or about the trade-offs, right? Absent GMOs, more people starve. Plain and simple. You can talk your way around that all you want, but GMOs save lives, and that's why I'm here.
Just very quickly to go back to what you said a moment ago about people wanting to feel good about themselves. I mean, there's a lot of literature now in international relations, international security, about how during war, CO2 emissions go up, right? During times of war, greenhouse gas emissions go up. And it's interesting, just to go back to Dan's point, that the types of people who are writing this sort of research, are very much on quite the far left, in terms of academics who write this sort of research. What is this, how are we going to see this develop? Because there is a trade-off there, isn't there? There's a trade-off between analysing war, and there's also a trade and analysing war through a climate-oriented perspective. I mean, how do you see this evolving?
I will confess straight away, other than as a father and a citizen, I don't devote a lot of time to the studies of war. Right? I conveniently look away. I leave that to you, perhaps. I think there's because I can't answer with the specifics, I'm going to try to give you a generalized answer. In any situation, we find ourselves with, I believe, two alternatives for how we make collective decisions. Very broad brush. Collective decisions, including how to create the situations through which most people will interact with the environment and the product of that behavior, and things like how we get along. Where do we put boundaries? How do we enforce them? Questions of war and peace. Those two methods of making decisions have different virtues. I don't want all one or the other. I am not an anarcho-capitalist. I will not tell you that on the one hand, market decisions are always superior. But we do use market solutions and market institutions to make a great number of decisions. And some of the virtues of market decision making is that when we run up against and abut against scarcity of any sort, the price system kicks in, and the effect is not just maybe surge pricing. The effect is innovation, because people will seek out substitutes. The alternative to making a collective decision is through political institutions. And I don't use political to mean bad or poor. I just mean different political institutions have different rules, majority and et cetera. Political decision making, the great virtue is you can find justice or equity, right? You can treat people alike. It is not innovative. It does not solve the problems of scarcity. And so that's, I guess, in questions of war, we're going to have scarcity of prestige. We're going to have scarcity of land. We're going to have scarcity of other resources, cultural artifacts that people try to allocate or preserve or capture. And political solutions don't seem to be entirely helpful there, but that's the best we have. For everything else, I would like to turn to markets, because that's where creation happens. It's not just allocation, which prices give us, but it's creation, and that's what, it's the difference between a positive sum and a zero-sum worldview.
That's a great note on which to wrap up.
Thank you.
So much,
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting and very thought-provoking. But I'm intrigued about how people are educated in this, how that message is sent through, because typically it comes through the media with misinformation. And you mentioned earlier about the Pope and what's going on there in his election. Nobody really knows. And you get all this misinformation put out in the media, and people will choose what they want to believe. How is it possible to more objectively educate people in terms of doing the right thing? The left wing, I think, I'm doing right. But they're not. They think they are, and they feel good about it.
Right.
But are they ineffective? How can that be?
Well, the first step is to monitor and measure what people do. Where do they spend their time? Where do they spend their money? Don't monitor and measure and try to track what people say they want. Watch what they do. And I think when you watch how they actually behave, we get much closer to having the information to create the rules for where we need to be. Thank you.